Oh, really?
Whatever. I smile. All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm Stan Pulliam, the mayor here in the city of Sandy, and I just wanted to welcome everybody to our community meeting here. We have a presentation by a consulting firm that the city is engaged in a contract with Murray Smith on our wastewater treatment process. As some of you may know or read about in local news over the last several years, there's been some fines that have been issued down by DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality, based on our wastewater treatment process and the inflow of our wastewater into our Tickle Creek. So it's and a lot of what leads to this is, one, is our process is a little bit antiquated, but also our growth in size is really leads to this process as well. So we're kind of here as a community, and we're faced with this issue. There's environmental concerns that are really important to all of us, and we have council here that's important to us here in council and all city government. And there's also important issues that we need to address as we grow. And Sandy's recently been classified in, what's this? Oh, thank you.
It helps me here.
Helps, perfect. Perfect, thank you. Sandy's been classified recently as a top 5 fastest growing city in Oregon. So, so we have several factors that we're facing that kind of leads us here tonight. What you're going to hear from Murray Smith is they're going to address some of the problems. They're going to provide some recommendations on an action plan as we move forward. And that action plan does come to an expense to us residents here in Sandy. Please do know that our council, this is a top priority for us. We're all hands on deck. Councilor Jan Lee is here. She has joined water resource committees on both the county and state level. We have Councilor Carl Exner, who's sitting in the back, that's engaged, many of you know, early on here with the Sandy Watershed Council as well as the Clackamas Watershed Council. And then all of us recently were in Salem together with Council President Jeremy Peetzold and Councilor Lori Smallwood, advocating on behalf of trying to find some state dollars and stuff to help us with this process to make it a little bit easier on our ratepayers. So this is a big moment for where we are as a community, and I thank you for coming here tonight to engage early in the process. There's a sign-up sheet out front. I hope many of you filled out. That's going to eventually here turn into our mailing list for some communication. We'll pass that around here as the meeting gets going. I'd ask you to allow our presenters here from Murray Smith to get through their presentation. There's going to be a lot of information here tonight, and then they will be opening up for a Q&A session at the end. So again, thank you all for attending. We definitely want all of our stakeholders involved early in the process and throughout the process to make sure that this is something that is good both for our environment and our water streams here in our community, but also allows us as a community to not be hamstrung on our growth and everything that kind of changes and gets thrusted upon us here with our beautiful and wonderful location that so many people want to live and enjoy. So with that, Matt Hickey is going to come up here from Murray Smith and start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. Again, my name is Matt Hickey. I'm the project manager with Murray Smith for this assignment. I'd like to appreciate the opportunity to present to you tonight the overview of the wastewater system facility plan we recently completed. So, the agenda for tonight, we'll talk about, provide a background on the wastewater system. Preston from Murray Smith will talk about some of the key challenges faces the city. Rob from Murray Smith worked on the project with us. He'll talk about the existing wastewater collection system and the repairs need to be made there. And Preston also talked about the preliminary recommended plan to upgrade the system. And then after that, we can talk about the next steps and open up for questions. Just a little timeline history of the wastewater system for the city of Sandy. The original wastewater system was constructed in 1952. And the first small water treatment plant was a 500,000 gallon per day facility in 1971. And the wastewater master plan was the last wastewater facility plan that was done, planning for upgrades was in 1993. And coming out of that, they did upgrades to the plant in 1998. And then here we are in 2019 doing the latest wastewater master plan to come up with a plan for the future for the city's system. Just an overview of the wastewater system that we'll talk about tonight. This is a map of the city, shows a number of the pipes in the city. There's several, of course, several pipes, conveyance pipes in the city that make their different ages and condition, and Rob will talk more about that. The collection system also includes pump stations and also laterals to the houses that convey the sewer to the trunk mains. That also includes the wastewater treatment plant. All the flow from the city goes to the plant, it's treated there. There's also discharge to a downstream water system after the water is treated. Much of the, and also the flow goes to a ISLA nursery, which I'll talk a little bit more about that. So one of the key aspects of the system is the discharge of the water after it's treated. That's a main factor in what we're doing with the master plan. So during the winter, the water is treated and sends it to Tickle Creek. This is a tributary to the Clackamas River. Tickle Creek's a relatively small stream, and it doesn't have much more capacity to take additional treated wastewater from the city as the city grows. The creek does not have capacity to take the additional water. So in the summertime, instead of discharging to the creek when the flows are low, the city discharges the flow to a storage facility and to the ISLA nursery, and they use that for irrigation. So it's a win-win for the city and the nursery. They can irrigate their plants with the treated wastewater, and this process will continue with the as future plan for the system. We'll continue to do this in the summer and create that good relationship with the nursery. With that, I'll hand it over to Preston to talk about some of the challenges the city face the city.
Thanks, Matt. So my name is Preston Van Meter. I was the wastewater treatment lead on the project for Mercer Smith. So I'll talk a little bit about the treatment elements and the discharge elements, the permitting side. Rob Lee is our collection system lead, so he'll talk about all the pipes that go up to your houses and some of the issues with leaky pipes. And so to start off, let's just go through the key challenges. They're there somewhere. There's really four that are kind of providing the constraints that we're trying to work around in terms of what we do moving forward. So the first is we have this leaky collection system. So the pipes in the city are old. When it rains, the flows go up really high. They inundate the wastewater plant. They cause overflows or peak flows through the treatment plant that inundates the system, and then it impacts the treatment process. And that strains the downstream process, which is a filtration process. And then it takes a while to get the treatment plant back into service and treating the wastewater well as the flows drop. So those peak events are really important. The key issue is it's a leaky system now. If you don't start to address it, it just continues to deteriorate. So it just builds on itself and compounds, and you see this exponential increase in the flows. If you don't go to the heart of the issue and start addressing that, we'll have a tough time building enough treatment capacity for the water that's coming down the pipe. Second key issue, wastewater treatment plant capacity, and maybe more importantly, the footprint. I'll show you the layout of the existing plant. It's in a pretty constrained site. It makes it difficult to expand out to the amount of treatment that you're really going to need to serve the community for the next 20 years. Community growth is an important issue. Mayor touched on that in his opening. You've doubled in size since the last treatment plant expansion was done, and you're going to double again in the next 20 years, even more than double in the next 20 years. Planning for that's pretty important to stay out in front of in terms of growth. There are some really specific limitations of Oregon regulations that we should discuss, and they're just constraints that we have to deal with, and they're specific to the existing discharge to Tickle Creek. So let's talk about those key challenges. Leaky wastewater collection system. This is a graph showing flows at the treatment plant over a 4-year period. Is that? Yeah, over a 4 or 5 year period. What you see is the lines that shoot up to the top. Those are the really big rainfall events. So you see they go straight up and they come straight down. So we have a really spiky system. It means there's probably a lot of inflow in the system, meaning like direct connections of rainwater to the sewer system. Rob's probably one of the best guys in the country in terms of collection system rehab. He'll talk about our plan on helping to address that. And we're hoping there's some real low-hanging fruit that we can go knock off in terms of inflow sources to drive those peaks down. Your collection system is shown here. All the red dots are pipelines that are at capacity. So what you see is up on the hillsides and kind of up in town, you see that the lines aren't red, but as you get down to the main trunk lines that come down into the treatment plant, they're kind of in the middle of town that go down to the west into the treatment plant. Everything's red. So all of those pipelines are over capacity. This is the 2040 design condition, but most of them are also over capacity now. So this is like a now issue. It's not a you're going to have an issue. This is something you're dealing with in your system as we speak. So the treatment plant capacity and footprint. The treatment plant was expanded to a flow capacity of about 7 MGD for a peak event. We think you get events above 10 MGD now. It inundates the influent flow meter, so we don't actually know the peak flow that you actually have seen at the plant. We've got up to 7. And that's about the last number we get. So when we do some extrapolations, we think there's some peak flows in the 10 MGD range. There's a very small equalization pond that, of course, this doesn't work on the screen. So on the left, you see the storage pond. It's a very small equalization pond. It doesn't have enough flow. It's minutes of flow, so it doesn't have a huge impact. It does help operationally when you have issues in the plant. It's a very tight site. There's wetlands on the north side. The city owns a lot of property down there, but future expansion on this site could be difficult. And then you have the issue of the last challenge, which I'll get to after this one. Community growth. We're showing the growth projections here. This is what was used in what we call your flow and load projections. That's how we design facilities. I didn't know the top 5, so congratulations. Good for Sandy. So we do know you're one of the fastest growing communities in Clackamas County, and we do know your population's doubled in the last 20 years from around 4,000, 5,000 the last time you were having this conversation as a community. You'll be a community of 23, 24, some thousand people over the next 20 years. So you become limited by your current discharge. Western Oregon communities with mechanical facilities like the city of Sandy just don't often have partial year discharges. That is 6 months discharge in the winter and then store and do something else with the water in the summer. We see it a lot in Eastern Oregon. We see it in a lot of communities that have not a lot of rainfall and lots of land. LeGrand has a huge lagoon system. You get a lot of rainfall in Western Oregon, and it doesn't tend to be conducive because you just have this big surface area that collects rainwater, it fills up, and you just keep expanding it. It creates more problems. So that is your discharge. That's what you have in your NPDES permit. Unfortunately, these mass loads in the red box are not allowed to increase in accordance with a rule called the 3-basin rule, which is a rule to protect drinking water sources in Oregon. So the Clackamas River Basin is one of the 3 basins. So when that rule was passed, or that law was passed, the mass loads in all of these NPDES permits, this is the permit that governs your discharge from the facility to Tickle Creek, they were locked, they're fixed, they're not allowed to go up. More importantly, it means you can't move from a winter-only discharge, which you have right now, and get a mass load increase for a summer discharge. So you're locked in the winter with what you have here, meaning you provide more treatment, which is possible. The summer season piece is the key. You're basically not allowed to ever get your flow in the summer into Tickle Creek or any other water body that's attached to the Clackamas River. Huge issue and one to keep in mind in terms of as we get into the talking about the future. Oregon dilution rule is another. I won't get into the specific equation. More or less, you're allowed to discharge about 10% of a creek flow at a specified certain level of pollutants. By 2040, you would exceed that on almost an every other day basis. It's about 40% of the time. Tickle Creek is just not very big. There are opportunities to move downstream in Tickle Creek to the confluence of Deep Creek, where there's more flow. We'll talk about the cost impacts of that. When it came down to looking at alternatives, what we discovered is we could keep the city barely in this basin and in this discharge for maybe 20 years. After 20 years, you will be stuck. You'll be right back here having the same exact conversation, but the numbers will be double. And you will have spent all this money on maintaining this discharge. So that's a central issue to think about as we talk about the challenges. Recycled water irrigation. So there are rules that govern recycled water irrigation and the water used by Isley Nursery. You're allowed to irrigate at agronomic rates. That means the rate that plants uptake the water. The big challenge, especially in Western Oregon, is in the shoulder months, we call them, May, October, when you're not allowed to discharge. There's a lot of rain, tends to be a lot of rain. In those months, when there's a lot of rain, it limits the amount of water you can irrigate. If you can't irrigate and you can't discharge, there's really only one other option, and that's to store. So you build lots of storage. You couldn't build that storage on site, so you would build that storage off site at the nursery or at some other place that if the city wanted to actually own those facilities. So I will say right now, the recycled water program the city has is fantastic. There is no way we would come up with a solution that didn't include that. It'll be critical in terms of maintaining your, whatever we do on your permitting side, maintaining that program will be something DEQ will be very interested in. That's a beneficial reuse is a primary driver of what they do on these NPDES permits. So we want to try to maintain that. However, it's a really good solution for a lot of water or a certain amount of water that the nursery can use for about 4 months in the summer. And that's probably the way we should look at that reuse program as you move out into the future. So Rob is going to talk a little bit about the existing wastewater system on the collection side.
Thanks, Preston. So Rob Lee with Murray Smith. I've been doing collection system work my entire career, and it's been a little refreshing coming into programs and projects like this because a lot of times we know what we know, and I work with a lot of treatment plant folks in my career, and they've all been, it's all about treatment. Get bigger treatment plants to handle all these problems that we're seeing throughout the nation. I'm a collection system guy, so I say, oh, we can solve a lot of problems just by sealing up our systems a little bit better. One of the things that we've realized through the decades of doing this work is there's an overall balanced approach that really makes the most financial sense for communities. So again, I know this laser pointer doesn't work, but really what this graphic is trying to demonstrate is if we try to do everything, try to seal up the system, it's a large collection system for the city. It's almost 300,000 linear feet of pipe in the ground, and that's just the sewer mains. It doesn't include the laterals. So you've got all this pipe in the ground, and trying to fix it all is going to be extremely prohibitive. Trying to treat it all is also going to be really expensive. And so our goal moving into the facility planning was to try to find what's that sweet spot, what's that balanced approach that leads to that lowest total cost. So just a little bit of background. I know I live and breathe this stuff, so not all of you are used to being talking about sewers. And it may not be the most fun. I'm glad we're not doing this over dinner. One of the things we wanted to identify is just kind of come up with the basic terminology of rainfall-derived infiltration and inflow. And so what that means, our systems were designed just to handle and convey our wastewater, what comes out of our homes when we flush the toilets, when we do the laundry, et cetera, et cetera. Unfortunately, like a lot of infrastructure, it allows clean water to get in. Rainwater, which we're defining as inflow, it's that rainwater that gets right into the system, or infiltration, which is groundwater that comes in through leaks in the pipe, open joints, whatever. And so those are highlighted with that two different colors, blue being the infiltration sources and that beige brownish color being inflow sources. Ideally, we have stormwater systems which handle the inflow sources. So we have those catch basins on the sides of our streets and rain gutters to catch all the rainwater off our roofs. And that should go into a storm sewer system and then flow right into our water bodies. Unfortunately, there's a lot of times where we have cross connections where, for whatever reason, those sources of direct rainwater are getting into our sanitary sewer systems. And they're just inundating and overflowing them, specifically during big wet weather events. So that's kind of the infiltration and inflow 101. One of the things that we did as part of this facility planning effort was we don't always get the opportunity to monitor the system when those peak wet weather events happen. And so what we do is we put flow meters in the ground, and we build a hydraulic and hydrologic model that's supposed to mimic how the system responds. And so that's what this figure shows. I'm not going to geek out on you guys and talk about every little detail of it, but in essence, the very top of the graph, the green bars are the rainfall. And then the blue is the flow rates, how much water was going past the flow meter during a wet weather event, and then the red line is what the model then shows. And our goal is to try to get those to be perfectly matched up the way that this graphic shows. So in essence, what we've done, like all models, we've built a model that then when we put the big rainstorms on, because they may not have happened, and in fact we didn't capture that last year when we had the flow meters in the ground, is now we can understand how the system does respond under wet weather events. So what that did for us is once we built that model, we put the big rainstorms on, we came up with an understanding of how badly the system leaks. One of the things that we've learned over the decades of doing this, ever since the Clean Water Act came out and early infiltration and inflow programs happened in the 70s and 80s, since that time we've learned a lot about what's most cost effective for communities when they try to seal up their systems. And so what this table, these numbers are showing is when we try to do just the sewer pipes in the street, the main lines is what we're calling them, we see somewhere around a 20% reduction in those peak flows. And that's, we're trying to replace or rehabilitate all of those sewer pipes in the streets. When we tack on the laterals, that's the smaller pipes coming from individual businesses or homes that connect into those pipes in the street. When we do that just to the edge of the street, so if we're digging up the street, we only have to do it once, that number goes up to around 40%-ish or so. And that's when we're trying to seal that up. But when we add on laterals and we try to go as close to the house as possible, to the foundation wherever we can, so we're trying to rehab or replace sewer laterals from the private building and seal up and almost like rehabilitate the entire system, we see a much, much higher reduction. Water's amazing. I'm sure anyone who's had a leaking basement or a roof just understands that water somehow gets in no matter how much we try. It's the little boy at the dike putting their finger in the hole, and then all of a sudden the next hole comes up and leaks. That's what our sewer systems do, and that's where this holistic approach comes into play. What really is important for the city of Sandy is, okay, what's the cost effectiveness? And that's what the second table to the right shows, is in the I&I world, the dollars per removed gallon of that clean water that's getting in our system, that's the most important. We want that number to be as low as possible so that we can remove more gallons of I&I for less dollars, that dollars per gallon removed. And you can just see the difference in the cost effectiveness of doing this holistic rehabilitation approach. This is some data that we have from a 12-year program that we did for the city of Sweet Home, Oregon. And that was a long-term program, 4 phases of work. Again, that dollars per gallon removed is a big takeaway here. Under those 4 phases of work that lasted over a decade, you can just see how some of that dollars per gallon removed was really, really good early on. A lot of that was attributed to removing those inflow sources, those stormwater, clean sources of rainfall getting into the system, taking those out right away in those early phases. And then the cost effectiveness just would drop a little bit over the subsequent phases because we're starting to hit pipe that wasn't leaking as badly. So again, that comes to the idea that there's a sweet spot between improving capacity at the treatment facilities and doing rehab in the collection system. But what this graph shows, this again is this data from the 4 phases of work in the city of Sweet Home. Originally, they were hitting a 22-to-1 peaking factor. So when it rained, those huge wet weather events, they saw flows spike to 22 times what they saw during dry weather. And it responded really quickly that you would expect to see from a stormwater system. It would shoot up, and then as soon as that peak of that rainfall would go down, it would come down pretty quickly. But what this graph shows is over the 4 phases of work, we saw that peak flow during those peak wet weather events reduce from 22.2 million gallons per day down to 11.5 million gallons per day. So I&I does work. It takes some time, it takes a commitment to it, but we definitely know that it can be done to help us get to that sweet spot that we're searching for. So what does this mean for the city of Sandy? Well, we divided the city up into mini sewer basins. We broke it up into 10 basins. We had to combine one basin because of, or 2 basins because of a lack of flow, quality flow data. But you can see throughout your city, there's a number of different peak amounts coming from each of those basins. And this data is a little hard to see just because of how widespread some areas are. There are some parts of the city that are extremely dense and other parts of the city that are more spread out. But what we're able to do with this facility planning effort is really identify where some of the worst leaking basins are. And we'll talk a little bit about the recommendations that came out of that as a result. But this is just the modeling data for the city of Sandy, Basin 8, one of the sewer basins. And that basin has as high as a 15-to-1 peaking factor for what DEQ regulates as the peak wet weather event. So 15-to-1, a lot of communities that are fairly tight see 3-to-1, 4-to-1. So 15-to-1 is tremendous, a tremendous amount of I&I getting into the system, inundating it, and then making its way to the treatment facility. And so what we're seeing here is just that we've got flows that do shoot up pretty quickly, but then they do remain elevated. So as that groundwater has increased temporarily from all that soaking rain, that water continues to get in, and that's pumping that water continuously. It's treating it, all that clean water that's getting in from these wet weather events. And so there's an approach, again, that we're searching that's a collection system approach with a treatment plan approach. So Preston's going to talk a little bit more about that treatment approach.
Okay, so how do we find, Rob talked about, okay, let's find that place where we have the optimum investments, right? We'll find that balanced approach where we do some work in the collection system, we do some work on the treatment side, and we optimize the amount of money that you as ratepayers, the community pays. You get the best bang for your buck. So to do that, we looked at 4 different scenarios to investigate the treatment costs versus the collection system costs. So there's a whole series of slides that goes along with this. I didn't put them all in there. We'd be happy to share more details with anyone if you would like to. Basically what we did is looked at treatment expansions with the same type of treatment process and then estimated the cost for all those at varying levels of peak flow. So the peak flow that we estimate if you did nothing to your collection system is 17 MGD in the build out here. So I said we think you get 1 million gallons a day. Sorry, MGD is 1 million gallons a day. We think you get flows around 10 MGD now. So you're looking at a number that's more or less double what you see now. The next scenario down then was 14, and then 10.5, and then 8.5, I believe was or 9 was the scenario 1. So as you can imagine, as the flow comes down, the collection system costs, rehab costs go up, and as the rehab costs go down, you do less, your treatment costs go up. And so what we're trying to do is find that spot where those graphs, those 2 graph lines cross. And I'll get to that point. To stay in the existing, basically keep doing what you're doing now, you would have to build at a minimum about 25 million gallons of additional storage at the nursery. That seemed to be the best location because you already have a pipeline down there. There are a series of pipeline upgrades and things that would have to be done in terms of the pipes and the infrastructure around there to be able to optimize that storage. And more importantly, staying in the current outfall location isn't viable past even today almost. You're right at the limit of the capacity of Tickle Creek where the discharge goes into the creek now. So it's about 2 miles downstream to where Deep Creek has a confluence with Tickle Creek, and so we had added in the cost of a pipeline to relocate that outfall further downstream. Those costs, when you look at the 4 scenarios, you can kind of see where that balance point comes. The 9 MGD scenario represents basically a replace your entire collection system, if you will. Alternative, obviously that cost is really high. On the right side, the 17.5 MGD, that's really do nothing to the collection system. We call it pump and treat. Just let it go down to the plant. We'll figure out a way to treat it. We'll build massive treatment facilities. I, as a treatment plant designer, would love that. You as a community ratepayer wouldn't like that, and Rob would think it's silly. So we kind of, you guys win, I lose. In the middle is really where we find that balance point. So somewhere in that 10.5 to 14 range is where we felt the optimum balance point was for the amount of investments you do in the collection system versus what you do on the treatment side. Some further investigation as we looked into these numbers then led us to the 14 number as probably the right number. One big reason on the rehab side, which Rob kind of alluded to, is some of the results of rehab are unknown. We don't know what we're going to get for results until we get in and we start doing it. So if we drive to too low a number on the rehab side and we miss, and we risk not having you build enough treatment capacity, then you're back here having the same conversation, not at the same level, but it's another conversation about what you have to do. So we like to be a little conservative on the rehab side. We hope we're good, we have more removal than we plan for, but it's one of those things we don't know until we get in and start looking at the system. So that's $60 million that you're looking at to keep doing exactly what you're doing today. Stay in Tickle Creek, relocate the outfall, build a bunch of storage, have Isley Nursery irrigate as much as they can, right on the bleeding edge of being kind of over the limit on what the whole system can support. As for irrigation, discharge to Deep Creek now. The one challenge is, in 20 years, that $20 million you spend on the discharge side is basically a sunk cost. You will not be able to do anything to stay in Tickle Creek or Deep Creek in 20 years. And it's probably faster at your rate of growth. It could be 15 years, who knows? I've never figured out how to be a good prognosticator of population growth, but it seems like you guys are growing fast, so I'd err on the side of caution. But that $20 million, what we started to look at when we got to this point, this was a little bit of a stressful time for us because we were talking to Mike and we kind of thought we were coming along to the solution, and it just doesn't work because you got this $20 million investment that doesn't make sense. So we quickly started thinking, okay, where do we go from here? And that's when we had to start looking for other options because it just didn't really seem like this $20 million investment by our community as a sunk cost made a lot of sense. So this gets us to where we landed. And I think most of you have a precursor for this and understand where we landed in terms of our phased approach. But Rob will talk about the collection system piece first, and then I'll talk about the treatment side.
Awesome. Thanks, Preston. So this just shows, again, the city's collection system. As folks I'm sure have already gotten that sense, flows move from the right to the left, and really what these different shaded areas represent are the different scenarios that where we would need to tackle I&I in the city to get to these flow levels that we were talking about on the different alternatives. And so really what we want to start with and where we ended up recommending was focus in on the highest leaking basins, that lowest dollars per gallon removed, and that's those two pink basins on either end. Generally some of the older pipe in the city, and a lot of our newer plastic pipes, PVC, has gasketed joints. They tend to not leak as much, newer laterals. So the pink areas really comprise a lot of the older parts of town. What that means on that dollars per gallon removed is numbers that look right within that sweet spot of what's cost effective, that it's more cost effective to address I&I than plan for that treatment. So while we found that balanced approach, it was great to be verified in that estimated dollars per gallon removed from those two pink basins, and then we call them basins 2 and basins 8. With all of that, Preston showed early on the red dots that showed there's limitations already within the system under the peak wet weather event. So there's additional cost that needs to happen just to enlarge some sewers, make some improvements at pump stations as well, just to make sure that all the flow that is getting into the system continues to get down to the treatment facility and not overflow out into sometimes what we call equalization basements, which is like the worst term in the world, but where flow is backing up into basements because it's got nowhere else to go. So there's improvements beyond just I&I reduction that's in those collection system costs. There are some near-term efforts that are being done right now, planning for moving into the summer. Smoke testing is a great way to find those direct connected sources. Basically, we just blow some smoke through the sanitary sewer system during dry periods where the flows are pretty low, and that smoke comes out through vents in homes, but it'll also come out through roof drains or catch basins or any other of those directly connected inflow sources. And so an effort's underway to plan for that and get that going this summer when the rains stop and then the groundwater drops down. We're going to do some CCTV work to verify. One of the beautiful things about I&I work is you get the double benefit. I talked about basins 2 and 8 being some of the older parts of town. Not only are we going to start sealing them up a little bit more from the I&I perspective, but we're going to renew that collection system, add in another 50 to 100 years of life in that collection system that's probably already hitting that age, kind of reaching the end of its useful life anyway. Developing a private source I&I policy, which is, I think, a really important thing. I&I is a great way to go, but you've got to hit the private I&I sources, the roof drains, the foundation drains, the laterals. And so the city's underway with starting to develop some of that private I&I policy. How are we going to address this? What's the best way to do it? A lot of different models that's been done throughout the country. And then ideally, identify those inflow sources and start to remove them. Get them off the system as quickly as possible. Preston's going to talk a little bit more about the treatment improvements.
All right, probably should just sit up here. Okay, so back when the last facility plan was done, there was a pretty broad evaluation looked at in terms of where to discharge, and it ultimately landed at the current seasonal discharge with the recycled water use program at the nursery. A very close second in that evaluation was actually at that time going and building a new outfall to the Sandy River. A couple other options were looked at. We did a quick observation. Going to the Clackamas River, we didn't really spend a lot of time on because there's really no reason with the 3-basin rule. We did look at exporting potentially to Clackamas County West or to the city of Gresham. The pipeline lengths are kind of ridiculous, and the numbers aren't worth really even talking about in terms of costs outside of what it would cost to actually connect to those systems and the installed infrastructure investments you'd have to make. So really the city has property that's on the Sandy River. You have a pathway to get there. It seemed like the most logical option in terms of how to control your own destiny and not be tied into some other system or even more expensive solutions. So we looked at 4 different alternatives, varying permutations of expand at the existing site and build a really big pump station up to the top of the hill and down into the Sandy River. Those are the first 3 alternatives, A, B, and C. Alternative D, I talked about the constrained site, and it's a pretty tight site, so those expansions would really build out the area. So once you got past this next phase and you'd have more constraints, you probably need to look at different technology in the next planning horizon, convert to membranes or some other kind of high rate system that would allow you to optimize the space. Rather than do that in alternative D, we looked at building a what we call a satellite facility. So we pull a good chunk of the wastewater that's in the collection system off higher up in the system before it gets down to the existing plant, way down low. We build a facility that treats the liquids, and then we call them solvents. So when we take the stuff that, when you do the number 2 flush, that stuff, we let that go back down to the existing plant and we treat it there, where we can build more capacity with a smaller footprint. So that's the difference between alternatives A through C and D. One of the nice options on alternative D is that it provides for a little bit more phasing. So think of it this way. That's an expensive pump station to pump up over the hill. You have an existing discharge into Tickle Creek. It doesn't necessarily have to go away. So one thought was, well, if we can get this discharge and start discharging to the Sandy River and we keep the current system, maybe there's a way to phase that so you build that pump station further down the road. As your city grows, you'll have more capacity to take on those investments, and you'll have time to allow development and other thing to help fund that pipeline that has to go all the way through town from the existing plant up over the hill. So that's really what you see here. You remember we talked about costs of around $60 million to keep doing what you're doing. The total program costs here are above that, but what you see for alternative D is that if you take the pump station out, the phase 2 and 3 costs, you're looking at a phase 1 cost that's about $56 million. So it's less than that $60 million that you would pay to stay doing what you're doing now, and you set yourself up to phase in those next 2 phases as you grow. So have more of your growth people that are new to the community help fund some of those future investments in the plan. So the recommended plan looks something like this. It turns out, it appears, we've recommended the satellite facility would be constructed at your original wastewater treatment plant location. So everything does come full circle. And we would install construct a I wish I had a laser pointer, but diversion pump station would go in the system. This is about where half the flow in the system is when everything comes together from this part of town. So we would pump the liquids up into the new treatment plant site. That facility would be a membrane bioreactor. That type of wastewater treatment is the highest quality water that we can produce in wastewater treatment economically. The next step is called reverse osmosis, and that's what they do in facilities that do groundwater discharge out in California, Texas, Arizona, and other places. New effluent pipeline would go down. This is the city-owned property right here, and it's not a sand river outfall, it would be a sandy river outfall. The existing wastewater treatment plant would remain. The installed cost that you have in that system would not be lost. What we would do is cap the flow, so those peaks that really impact the treatment plant operations, we would shave those peaks off to the new facility and send that really clean water down to the Sandy River. This is somewhat what the rough layout of the site. The city's property is 4.5 acres. You can see the footprint. The actual treatment facility is the 2 color boxes. They are very compact facilities. They're boxes. I've designed quite a few of them. They're easy to control odors in. They're easy to cover. They have small footprints. They're high rate systems. You could do lots of other things on that 4.5 acres as you develop this site. There's lots of facilities that have new wastewater treatment plants that have beautiful parks around them. Marine Park in Vancouver is a wastewater treatment plant where people get married. That certainly is something you can consider here. I don't know if you want to host weddings, but you could build some park features in the area. So we did a rough layout. It does not have to look like this. We just wanted to do something to get a range of cost for the facility. This really awesome, complex graphic summarizes the recommended plan, but basically what it shows is what I've been talking about. This is the satellite treatment facility, it's the MBR. It gets diverted over through a pump station. The collection system work gets done. That's all phase 1. You continue with the discharge to Tickle Creek out of the existing plant. The solids that we pull out of the satellite facility would still go down the collection system to the existing plant. The second phase, we would upgrade the existing treatment facility because it's going to need some work as the flows come up in the system and you grow. This facility, we can't ignore it, and DEQ's not going to let you ignore it because it needs some work. Ultimately, the light blue then would be the pump station at some point that you would connect. And I don't know that you need to decide when that day is. It could be driven by how much you grow or how effective the system is once we get it installed. So that's a breakdown of the plan. You see the $57 million for the first phase. Second phase is mostly focused on the existing plant, going back and fixing that up once we see how the existing facility operates and how how much of the diversion flow we can actually get into the treatment facility, the MBR facility up higher in the system. Phase 3 is more on the conveyance pumping side. And then that beyond 2040 is really that effluent pump station from the existing plant up to the Sandy River outfall, which is out beyond the 20-year planning horizon. So we're actually not including that in the numbers for the recommended plan. Next steps. So we're just working on a contract to start some additional steps to refine costs, make sure we're not getting too out in front of the process in terms of establishing costs and have it become a basis for establishing rates and SDCs and things like that. So there's some refinement work we can do there. We have thought about taking a group out to do some reference site visits. There's lots of MBR facilities that we could visit. Some have parks around them. Some have similar satellite systems. There's several that I've worked on in Oregon and Washington that would be great opportunities. There's also Clackamas County West has the Tri-City Wastewater Treatment Plant, which is an MBR facility. It actually has a walking tour you can do that's an educational tour, which I think you can just walk up and do anytime. It's an outside tour. We will prepare some conceptual layouts. Temperature is going to be the big issue for the discharge to the Sandy River. We have to start looking at that and trying to sort out what the options are there. There is a meeting called a Kaizen meeting that's conducted at an early level with regulatory agencies, which we plan to schedule and conduct hopefully in the next couple of months. And that'll start that process of the conversation about, okay, what is this Sandy River discharge really gonna be, and how much time is it gonna take, what's it gonna take, what do we have to consider, what are the issues and concerns of the various stakeholders, and they're important. There's been a lot of work done on the Sandy River, and it's a pristine river. Matt's favorite fishing hole is right near where we're showing that pipeline. So there's a lot of considerations there, and we think this is the start of a fairly long process in terms of that. But I honestly feel like we have looked at everything you could possibly look at, and I feel like that's the best solution. And so it's a matter of, if you let the can get kicked down the road over the next 20 years, this conversation is a lot more painful than the cost is probably double, and you have already spent all this money to stay where you're at. So sometimes you just have to have those tough conversations. And that's not, I'm not giving you advice, I apologize, but it feels like this is the time to have it, because you're right at that tipping point for Tickle Creek. Near-term schedule, so we're in this public process. I don't know that the city has a thought for exactly when to close it. I think that they would like to receive all of the comments that anyone has, and we'd like to respond to them. Did I say that right, Jordan?
Absolutely.
And then beyond that, it would be renegotiating the mutual agreement order that has a pretty finite schedule that contemplated a different project than where we're at in terms of this recommended plan. Responding to comments, finalizing the plan, and then getting into adoption. I don't know, Mike, Jordan, if you guys have any other.
Well, I would just say, as the mayor mentioned at the beginning of the meeting, we're very interested in the public learning about this plan and having the opportunity to dive into, what is it, a 400-page facilities plan, and understand, what is the plan for addressing these issues that we're facing. And if you're like me, you hear these presentations, and I think this is the second time I've heard this presentation, and I'm still figuring out what the acronyms mean and all
Sorry.
that. So it is, it's complex, it's technical, but when it comes down to it, it's about the future of this community and how we treat the wastewater and how we do that in the best way that balances environmental and, managing for growth and doing it in a cost-effective way. So we do want to provide enough opportunity for people to dive into that plan, provide comments, and also give us a chance and the consultants a chance to digest those comments, respond to them, incorporate where we can into that plan, get back to the stakeholders about hearing what you have to say about it. And doing a very public process too, so people know what's going on, and that's very important to us. So.
And let's see, for more information, I believe you can go to this link on the city's website, which we were at earlier today. There's some information there, and I think there'll be the postings and various things regarding the project will be posted on our website. So with that, I think we'd love to take your questions.
Is that too fast for you? So just a quick question. So Laura Small with the City Council. Is there some potential for some pretty heavy legislation coming down the pipe for temperature for river water with salmon and whatnot? Let me ask it this way. Do you see a potential for the Sandy River to not be an option? And if so, is there a secondary, is there a plan B?
There's always a plan B. It's a matter of cost, right? There's not I don't know that there's another option in the same order of magnitude costs. That's the only easiest way to say that. There is a reserve allocation for temperature in the Sandy River TMDL. So I think there is some thermal waste load allocation that is potentially available after you go through the anti-degradation evaluation process. The litigation, I believe, well, it's hard to say the litigation isn't closed, but it was really to attack what we call the natural conditions criteria in the standard. We think that criteria will go away, but the rest of the standard likely stays in place. And we kind of know how to work around those limitations. So there's been a lot of work done on the Sandy River on discharges and maintaining temperatures. So I think that's the biggest issue. I think you hit the nail on the head. I just don't know that honestly, if there's a better option, we would have stuck it in the plan.
Following up on the temperature issue, why wasn't the temperature addressed, the cost of dealing with the temperature issues addressed in the initial plan? Because it seems like that'd be important for understanding what the cost is going to be for choosing and informing the city council to choose which alternative is going to be most effective?
I think that's a fair question.
Repeat the question first.
Oh, sorry. Why wasn't the cost for temperature mitigation included in our evaluation? Number one, we know there is a reserve allocation in the Sandy River TMDL. We don't know what the level of that allocation could be written or taken over by a Sandy River discharge for the city. So we don't have an understanding of the delta that we're trying to get to in temperature mitigation. That's certainly an unknown. We think that the costs for the outfall have quite a bit of contingency built into them, and there's some alternatives we could look at to where it's around $12 or $13 million for that outfall piece. With the river crossing and other things, there may be ways to take some of the costs and contingencies built into that outfall piece to address some of the temperature issues. Treatment wetlands are very cost effective, so we feel like the bucket's right sized. It just maybe hasn't been distributed in the right place. So one of the things we talked about in the continuing efforts, one of the first efforts, is to look at the temperature impacts, what that excess thermal load would be coming off the facility, and then try and understand what the opportunities are to mitigate that temperature before the outfall goes in, and then understanding in conversations with DEQ and others what the potential wastewater allocation is we could pull from the reserve allocation in the river. That's the answer I have for your question, which is not a great answer.
You just mentioned treatment wetlands. Are you looking at those in both Clackamas and Pickle Creek Clackamas Basin and in the Sandy Basin? And where, I mean, that seems like a pretty important part of a system, and so knowing where that's going to go and how it would work.
I don't know how you overcome the regulatory limitations that stay in the Clackamas River Basin, so my thought has been to look at them on the Sandy River side.
Right, but as far as the natural treatment systems, are you located a area where you put those?
No,
or
sir.
how that work?
I think following up what Steve was talking about, I think it's important to recognize that relative to temperature, we're not just talking about the local TMDL, but the Sandy plays a role in the overall Mainstem Columbia TMDL, which is not established at this point and is under discussion. Right now, Sandy is designated as a cold water refuge. Certainly, that is now being measured as relative to the main stem temperature, but there may actually be a target temperature that the Sandy has to meet at some point. So it goes beyond this local TMDL that you're talking about. And it's important in terms of mitigation and establishing the cost of mitigation, because it can be quite large depending on how much of an impact this alternative site will have on the Sandy.
Well said. I don't have that wasn't really a question, was it?
Well, no.
I mean, I totally agree.
You can't.
I totally agree. We have to define the constraints, and we have to look at the numbers and evaluate options, and there's lots of riparian restoration opportunities that folks have partnered with Freshwater Trust to do. Maybe there's opportunities on the Sandy to do that. That's been looked at in Corvallis and Medford. Some of those systems are under litigation right now, but there's lots of opportunities on the partnering side that could be looked at. I think we need to, I think the city should try to keep all options open, and probably the best way to do it is to engage with the watershed groups and try to come up with the best option. It's kind of like, it's a little bit rock and a hard place. Nobody probably wants the discharge, but we've got to find a place to put the water, because we can't put it in the ground because you can't afford the treatment. Yes, sir.
Yeah. When is your temperature assessment for the Sandy outflow substation going to be available?
Well, it's in our next scope of work, which I think we're planning to get done over the next several months. So probably late spring, early summer, I would think. Sorry, he asked when our temperature evaluation would be available. Yeah, probably in early summer. This is a good assumption. Yes, sir.
Preston, have you considered multiple satellite MVR system stations?
We have not, it wouldn't be out of the question.
It seems like that would definitely cut down on outfall volume, and temp would be easier to deal with if you were dealing with much smaller quantities heading that direction. And I didn't hear anything about pervious systems or vegetated weirs within the city of Sandy to try and limit the amount of infiltration we have going into this system. Is there a way, to deal with the source at the surface level instead of redoing all pipes?
Rob, is there a way to deal with the source other than rehab?
Yeah, I think just through the years, we have not seen any other cost-effective ways that really reduce to the degree that the city needs to reduce these flows. I got my start in the I&I world on a $250 million I&I program. It was a 24-year program because they didn't own the treatment facility, and they had no choice but to try to tackle the I&I problem. And that's where we really, it was one of the first programs that was on the East Coast where we got an understanding of what was effective and what wasn't. Water finds its way in. When there's a hole, it'll find its way in. And so that holistic approach really seems to be the only one that is cost effective. A lot of the issue just comes from the way our pipes were constructed. There's an envelope of rock or sand that is put around the pipe when they install the pipe. And when water is in the ground, it finds its way into that trench and just runs along that trench the way like a gravel bed would run. And so even if we could slow it down, it depends on where the groundwater is, but once that groundwater gets above our pipes, it finds its way in. We seal up one leak, it finds its way into the next one. And that's where this holistic approach really does seem to make the most sense. So one day we might find a solution. When we do, I will patent it, and it'll be the lead infiltration solution, but until then, my best recommendation is this holistic approach.
Well, just offhand, it just seems like when you have your heavy rains, that's when your spikes are. So it's obviously it's a weather issue. And this has been proven to do, all throughout Portland. Watershed Council has a project going on right now in Mount Hood Community College, creating pervious systems and water collection systems to try and cool down the water itself. I would, really think that this would be something to look at, to try and minimize the amount of water that's following your trenches, and to deal with it at the surface level.
Right. Yeah, and that's what the smoke testing that the city has is in the planning stages to do, is to try to disconnect any of those sources. I think, if you guys recall the graph that we showed, Basin 8, where it comes up and then it doesn't come back down right away, which is what you'd expect when that peak of that rainfall passed, but it stayed elevated. That's because the ground is saturated with water and that water continues to leak in. So even if we could slow down what's coming in from the surface level, that ground is still going to get saturated no matter what, just kind of the nature of the way the rainfall will get into the ground. Even removing impervious surfaces, and that's a big push I know in the Portland area, break up paved areas, make them pervious so that water soaks into the ground. It's going to find its way into leaking systems, and so our goal is to seal those up so that water doesn't get into our sanitary sewers.
Point's well taken though. I mean, green infrastructure, green streets, and the more we can do in treating, the water as it comes down out of the sky, and other ways is a good goal in itself. In terms of stormwater management, and if that can help some of this infiltration as well, that's great. We're getting two birds with one stone, so to speak. So I think that's going to be part of our analysis, is looking in additional ways that we can maybe recycle. As some new technologies come online, is there ways to reuse that water? Is there other green infrastructure projects that we can do to limit the amount that we have to treat and then discharge? And something that we definitely want to explore.
The key thing I'd offer, and I think Portland has struggled with this a little bit, is regulatory assurance. So you want to be making investments in solutions so you're not under this DEQ hammer that you're kind of in a place of right now with the MAO. And some of the green solutions Even on the rehab side, some of those green solutions have been successful and others haven't been as successful. I know there's a pretty good history of varying levels of success on some of the green infrastructure programs that the city had as part of its CSO program. But I agree wholeheartedly with the concept that if we can create infiltration and we can reduce stormwater runoff, where that would allow leakage into the system, there has to be benefits.
On that same topic, and thinking back to the diagram that was shown of roofs and foundation drains that may be connected to the sanitary sewer system, just to clarify, are you saying that there are stormwater pipes throughout the city, that some of these things are just misconnected, or did I understand that right?
Yeah, and Mike, I don't know if you want to talk about, we didn't evaluate the stormwater sewer system, but there are places, and that's throughout every community I've ever seen, a plumber just disconnects. We've seen the worst case scenarios, floor drains in the basements, where that is supposed to, people are cleaning their basement floors with chemicals. It's supposed to go right into the sanitary sewers. But what happens is when people's basements start leaking because the water's coming up, we've seen a number of places where people will open up those floor drains, take a screwdriver and a hammer and just pop a hole in the bottom of that trap. And now that groundwater comes up and it goes right into the sanitary sewers, right into the lateral. And now you're, in essence, draining the entire foundation into the sanitary sewers. So as much as we try to find and eliminate all these sources, there's places where people have just made mistakes, intentionally or unintentionally, whatever their intentions are. And we've seen places where catch basins, the storm gutters, those smoke has come out of there when we've done the testing. And it's not because they're actually connected right to the sanitary sewers, but it was actually because the pipes themselves leaked so badly that all that stormwater that got in there and was supposed to get over to the sanitary sewer, or the storm sewer, the big sewer pipe, it was just draining out of that, going right into a leaking lower sanitary sewer. And so those are the things what we're looking for with the smoke testing, is to find those and disconnect those.
Right. So there are storm sewers throughout the city then?
Yeah, we don't have a combined system like Portland,
Okay.
at least not by design. Portland intended to create one
Yes,
many years ago.
Right.
We did not. We probably by accident have a combined system in some places, but there are storm sewer pipes in most of the city.
Okay.
I may have missed it, but going forward with implementation, if you have the existing system and you're going to rehab it as much as you can, how would you see implementation with this auxiliary site, this option D at first? And then for a longer term, after you have this full 40-year development of population, is it 50-50? Is it 80-90-10 to start with and then goes that direction, or?
In terms of flow, where you make investments, like what?
Well, in terms of, if you were implementing it in the next 5 years, are you relying on the primary system and then only the auxiliary system picks up rainwater high events?
No.
Or is it right away 50-50?
Yeah, so great question, awesome question. So the question was, what do we rely on the auxiliary system in the near term and just kind of turn it on when there's like a spike, right? And we just turn on the diversion pump station. No, because wastewater treatment is a biological process and bugs don't grow instantaneously, so we need to build up a bug population, and it takes not hours or days, it takes weeks and months. So what we want to do is base load the satellite facility and keep running that facility, make really clean water, as clean a water as we could make, and then operate both facilities at the same time.
So right from the beginning, it'd be kind of like a 50-50 split?
More or less. The initial phase of the facility, the MBR facility, the satellite facility, is sized at about half of its ultimate capacity, so 3.5 MGD. 3.5 MGD peak flow. So there would still be more flow going down to the existing plant. What we're trying to do is keep the peak flow to the existing facility in that 7 MGD range. That's kind of the capacity of the system down there, so that we don't have the treatment issues that they're experiencing fairly regularly down there right now. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
And then, so the other thing to add to that, is that what we're hoping to rely on then in the near term is you make the investments to get this satellite facility operational. And we have some success on the rehab side, so we're able to keep the existing facility in compliance, not make the big investments in the existing facility. There's some work that needs to be done there, but don't make those big investments until you've got this, you've gone through the hard part of getting this facility operational. Yes, ma'am.
I know you've worked with some other cities, and we know that in some cases, the private homeowner will have to pay for some work on the laterals. I know our conservation district got a fairly large loan from DEQ and was able to then loan it to our customers. I wondered if you'd seen any model like that in this kind of work.
Yeah, I can take that question. So I'll give you a couple examples of what folks have done. That City of Sweet Home program, early on, a lot of that work, it's a bedroom community, around 10,000 people, a little under 10,000 people, and some of the early work, actually all 4 phases were funded by DEQ loans. Recently, because those loans are sourced from EPA, they changed the requirements around those loans where you couldn't do work on private property assets, you had to own them. And so that happened in the 4th phase, the most expensive phase, where Sweet Home was faced with this. If we use this loan money on private property, we're gonna have to actually go and end up taking ownership of all those private laterals, which is a tremendous amount of pipe for any city to own and operate and maintain. So they ended up having a separate fund that they used, not funded out of the loan, but then they would pay for that lateral work. So the city took it upon themselves to pay for all that lateral work. The city of St. Helens, we were involved with a 9-year, $12 million I&I program there. What they did is they have it in their city code that private laterals are not allowed to have excess groundwater or rainwater get into them. And they decided, we want to enforce this. And so they actually sent CCTV videos to individual property owners. They did this huge public involvement program. And they said, we're going to provide 5-year, 0-interest loans if you qualify for them. But you need to have your lateral rehabilitated or replaced in the next 6 months or next 12 months, depending on the situation. Those were targeted around those basins so I'm sure some homeowners felt like, well, why are you pointing me out? What about that guy, 2 blocks down? Who happened not to be in that same basin, that sewer shed, but it ended up being, they got 95% participation from that. And again, similar bedroom community, similarly sized. I'll give one other, probably more fun example. Johnson County in Kansas, they had an early I&I program, and what that county decided to do is they bought the laterals from the homeowners for $1 each, and then did the rehab work, because they were now doing work on public property, and then they sold the laterals back to the homeowners for $1. So it was a way for them to be able to do work without getting all these easements and homeowner agreements. Just buy the lateral, sell it back, get the work done. So there's a lot of different models out there.
Albany?
Oh yeah, Albany has a sewer lateral replacement program, and they actually, real estate agents have caught on to it. Basically, they will fund the replacement or rehabilitation of a sewer lateral just if someone applies for it. And they have a certain amount of money, a certain pot of money, and once that money's gone for that year, then the program's closed for the year, and then they'll renew it every year. And that's their way of systematically addressing laterals throughout the city because they're all leaking. I recommend a program like that for the city of Sandy if you could target those laterals into the worst leaking basins. So just because someone's selling their home, they want to get a new lateral out of it. If there's no benefit to the city, that probably wouldn't be the highest priority candidate for the city, but that's another great example.
Did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
While you're still up there, the Portland area is scheduled to have, I think any day now, they're planning to put in a fairly good sized earthquake. And I would imagine that's going to affect us quite a bit. Have you looked at what that potential earthquake would happen and how that would affect our sewer lines and what kind of things would you suggest that we would be putting into facilities to be able to prevent that going just down completely?
Yeah, so there's two different parts to, oh, sorry. You have to-
Matt would want to take.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And actually, Matt,
like
you'll be
jumping
perfect
up.
for this, yeah. So the question was about seismic resiliency, right? The wastewater system's ability to withstand a seismic event like the Cascadia subduction zone event. One of the interesting things that's happened from what we've learned from other places that had earthquakes, again, from the collection system side, one of the big earthquakes in Japan that happened in the early 2000s, they've had the chance to go back and reassess the pipelines and how well those pipelines have held up during that earthquake. They found that around 0.7% of those pipelines were negatively affected by the earthquake. A really low percentage. Because a lot of times what happens, and I think Sandy's probably in a good situation, the pipes will move with the ground. Unless we happen to be in areas where that pipe, the ground shakes to the point where it liquefies, almost turns into a liquid, then we're worried about our pipes moving all out of whack. So that's on the buried pipes in the ground. I think the bigger concern on a seismic event is anything above ground. There's a handful of pump stations in the city of Sandy, and then obviously the treatment facilities. Matt's leading our seismic resiliency study for the city of Gresham, so Matt, you might want to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, like Rob said, I think the pipes, and with the lining of the pipes, like when doing the repair, they'll usually line them with CIPP cast in place or cured in place liners. So that helps the old concrete pipes withstand ground movement, some liquefaction. I don't think there's many areas, like Rob was saying, Sandy doesn't have many areas of possible liquefaction. We have saturated sands, things like that. The pump stations, that is something, we did a pump station assessment, a condition assessment, all the pump stations in the system. We didn't specifically look too much at seismic, but that's something that the city could consider in the future. Look at some of the seismic improvements to those pump stations. And of course the plant, having the new MBR plant would be designed to the latest seismic codes. That gives you quite a bit of redundancy in the system. Upgrades to the existing plant would also have upgrades. Those upgrades would be, the new improvements would be, we budget, would have, meet with current seismic codes, and the city could look at probably retrofitting some of that as well. It's usually reinforcing your buildings, making sure your ground conditions are satisfactory and so forth. So things you can do, but yeah, it's an excellent question because it is a definitely concern in this area. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
I have a question. I don't know if I got this right, but what I thought I heard you say was that during the months of May through October, all the water is currently going to the beneficial use at the Isley Nursery. Is that correct?
Unless the flow is above 4 MGD. No, it all has to go to Isley. Yes, that's correct.
So, and as the population increases, will that still be the case?
Under what scenario?
As
Under the scenario where you build a salad facility?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so there will be no discharge to the Sandy River May 1st to October 31st?
Oh, no, I answered that wrong. The flows that go down to the existing plant until the pump station is built to go up to the Sandy River, those flows would go into the river, into the creek, or to Isley. The Sandy River, I would recommend that be pursued as a year-round discharge for a full 14 MGD or whatever the design flows.
So why isn't there, you said that the beneficial use is the best way to deal with the water.
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't you exploring additional beneficial uses if Isley can't handle the capacity, especially in the month of May and the very wet month of October?
Mm-hmm.
Why aren't you exploring other beneficial users?
That is a great question, and that is something that could be explored to use more of that water in the May to October period, so you don't have to build as much storage. I think what you'll find is very often the best reuse opportunities are agricultural, land-based, right? They're always gonna be limited by agronomic irrigation rates. The holy grail for reuse programs is the year-round industrial uses, cooling towers, things like that. I don't know how many of those types of facilities are available in the area and how costly it would be to expand that reuse program. So to the extent that you can get there and it's feasible, it's economically feasible, I would wholly agree with expanding the reuse program beyond Isley to other areas as if the water's available. I guess the question is, what's the cost of that expansion? That was outside the scope of the study that we did this study anyway.
So I'm a little confused because I think you previously said for that satellite system to function, you actually need a certain amount of flow in there.
Right.
For maintaining your biological
Correct.
population for degradation.
Correct.
So as Steve pointed out, if we're going to divert that water in May and October, which are potentially high peak times, you're still gonna need some base flow into the satellite facility.
Right.
It
So,
won't
so,
affect the sandy district.
so that finding alternative sources won't affect the sandy discharge.
Correct, but it may provide the need for less storage, say at Isley Nursery, because you have more irrigation demand.
Right. So the bottom
Or something
line-
along those lines.
Right, but the bottom line is, that flow into the sandy, if the temperature evaluation comes out such that there's an issue, there's going to have to be something considered, because that flow is gonna be continuous
Correct,
all year round.
correct. That's the intent. If I misspoke, I apologize. That's what I meant to say.
Okay.
And weren't you dealing with a?
Did you, hold on, sorry.
I think the question relative to finding additional areas to land apply the treated water, I think we had a discussion at the Sandy River Basin Council meeting. The Isley Nursery has a unique situation where they have the potted plants. I think Mike was describing this earlier, where they do have quite a bit of demand for irrigation. Other nurseries have the plants in the ground, and so they don't have quite as much irrigation requirement. And so looking at other nurseries, there's only so much you can apply. And I think Mike said Isley has one of the biggest potted facilities in the area, so.
I think they're one of the larger container nurseries in the state.
Yeah, container nurseries, so.
But you didn't analyze other options. You didn't do an analysis for available other options.
We did look at there's some other nurseries in the area, but we did look at additional storage at Isley, and that's.
We did not do a detailed reuse system expansion evaluation, no.
I think, eventually, as climate change happens, I think this will be a resource. And so, hopefully, we'll have people coming to us and say, hey, we'll take some of that, MBR treated water, which is, very high quality. We'd like that to use at our facility, and we want it so badly, we'll pay for the, piping and the pumping to get it there. Right now, we were fortunate to find somebody to take our discharge at no cost, and, as climate change occurs, we may have people coming to pay us for this resource. And so, if those opportunities present themselves, we'd be remiss if we didn't pursue those. And so, especially, this is gonna be very high quality water that's treated, so.
That's true.
There's lots more opportunity for reuse with water from an MBR than there is from, conventional activated sludge plant. So, Jordan mentioned too, we could, with new development, we could look at putting in like, a purple pipe system where some of it could be used for irrigation. And, we do that now with our Sandy Net service. We require that the developer put in the conduit for fiber optic service to the home. And we could do the same thing and require the developers put in the reuse pipeline so that, maybe some of this can be used for irrigation. Even though, like, Matt mentioned, irrigation in Maine and Oregon is generally much less than would be in Arizona or California or something. But it's still something that could be pursued.
So you mentioned that the water that you pump in back into the ground in LA and some of these other facilities is a lot more expensive because the quality has to be even that much more higher. Is the water that we're not producing now of high quality, like Mike said, that's drinkable? It's
Out of the existing plant,
yes.
it is not drinkable. No.
So out of the new facility that you're talking about, that's of the higher quality.
The membrane effluent is the most cost-effective, highest quality treatment process that we can provide for that type of facility. The groundwater injection facilities I worked on, the groundwater injection program in Monterey on the peninsula for Monterey One Water, that is a MF microfiltration, RO, UV AOP. So there's advanced oxidation processes downstream of reverse osmosis, which is very expensive. And that's the water that they put down in the ground for indirect potable reuse. They put it down in the ground, it comes back up 6 months later, and it's drinking water. So that's a much higher level of treatment and a much higher level of cost, both in installed infrastructure and operating costs. So to get to that level where you have drinking water quality, there's 2 more positive barriers applied to get to direct potable. But we're on the very, I said MFRO, UVAOP, right? We're talking MF, but microfiltration. That's the type of system. That's cost effective for a community your size, and that's what we're proposing here. The water is almost not discernible from your drinking water when you look at it from just in a jar.
And then the water that you're putting into these nurseries, is that, those ponds, are they lined at the bottom of them? And would that be needed for that, or can you allow that to seep into the ground and be infiltrated back into the ground? For instance, forgive me, I'm not at your experience level, but could we create a lake, and pump that into a lake that then drains out, and it's clean water, maybe not for drinking, but neither is any lake water.
I don't know the answer to the question. Maybe the Isley folks could answer the question on the lining of the ponds. I assume they're pretty tight because in the summer they want to maintain their water supplies.
Is there a restriction though? Is it forced that you have to do that?
Yeah, it's recycled water coming off the plant. It's not allowed to. So the rule is it's a molecule is not allowed to get back into waters of the state. Groundwater is considered waters of the state, so it's generally not allowed to infiltrate. There are allowable leakage. There are wetlands that leak. That's a fact of life. So there is some allowance for leakage, but generally, if it's recycled water, it goes out of recycled water outfall. It's supposed to be reused and not get back to what we call waters of the state. So the infiltration.
The ponds at Isley or the retention pond at Isley is clay lined, so it's not like a plastic membrane or anything like that, but it's lined with clay. So once you put water in it, you don't want the water to leave, and it's just by using clay to keep the water in the pond.
It stays there while you use it, and then. So
No.
we couldn't create like Sandy or.
No, you could. I shouldn't say that. Under your current permit, if we call it recycled water, there are groundwater discharges permitted. Lot has a groundwater discharge off of their facility up in Olympia. So you would have to change the type of permit, and there would be different water quality requirements, and you'd have to have a site that could allow for groundwater injection and a whole host of other evaluations to provide for that. I don't know that the soils in this area are conducive to an infiltration program. That's
Sandy
not
is
something.
poorly named. There's no sand. We'll tell you that.
Yeah, infiltration rates are not good.
Or just looking at double, maybe an economy boost, a recreational area, buy a lodge, by the way. Hey, the options out there, right?
The drainage, so the infiltration gallery in Olympia is an awesome site to see. I'd recommend going up and walking around it. It's a really cool facility. But it's in, lot is Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, Thurston County, thank you. So the Olympia area, they have an infiltration system off of one of their MBR facility that they built, which is a satellite treatment facility, actually. Yes, sir.
This is a comment, so not a question, but regarding Isley Nursery and the use of the water that's received from the treatment plant. We have the permit period, which is May 1st till October 31st. And the challenging times of year to use all the water that's sent from the treatment plant that were pointed out is May and October. And the reason those times of year get challenging is because it tends to rain in May and it tends to rain in October. When it rains, anyone in agriculture doesn't tend to need to irrigate because you get it through rainfall. So, you know, looking for alternative sources in agriculture, the problem that needs to be solved is May and October. And, you know, otherwise the rest of the permit period, the other 4 months of the permit period are not a challenge for Isley Nursery to use that water. It's the shoulder seasons. And, you know, my opinion in dealing with that water is in agriculture, you're still gonna have that same challenge if you look for other ag uses for May, you know, to solve the problem in May and October. It rains in May and October and there's not gonna be a use for it in ag. Potentially.
What
Great
about,
comment.
what about outreach to other neighboring municipalities about connecting into their systems as an alternative?
Do you have any in mind?
Boring?
So we're doing the facility plan for boring now. They have a very small discharge. They'd actually like to send their wastewater. One of our alternatives is actually to pump to Sandy. That we're
Not happening.
The other,
Well, yeah, for 70 million.
remember the 3-basin rule. There's no mass load increases. That's a 50,000 gallon a day facility. It's not even in the realm of possibility to think about boring. Going further down the hill, the most logical is probably Gresham because they have 2 treatment plants on that site and they probably have enough capacity. But you'll have to pay for the installed infrastructure already. You'll have to buy into the plant, into whatever's there, and then you'll have to pay to get the pipe there. And I think you looked at the pipeline cost, didn't you?
Yeah, it was 80 million plus, 80, 90 million.
Right, but my question is if Boring's looking at this process and they've got to send their treated water somewhere, it might, from talking to folks in Boring, it's sounding like it's gonna go to Gresham. Why would we have to go to Gresham when we only have to go as far as Boring?
Well, remember, you're talking about 14 million gallons a day. That's about a 30-inch pipe. Boring is about, the max is 100,000 gallons a day. That's about a 6-inch pipe. So, I mean, if wherever Boring goes, you know, their pipe would fit in your pipe 5, 6, 7 times, right? So it's just a different problem, maybe, is the best way to answer that. They just have, it's a really small system. We're not looking at the Gresham option in Boring, so maybe I should talk to someone who you're talking to.
Oh, interesting.
Where does Gresham discharge there?
Columbia River.
That's where Sandy goes.
What size sand filters system would you use, or could you use with your satellite MBR system? How many acres would it require to just, that system to dump into a sand filter?
What would the filter do?
Allow your effluent back into your.
Oh, for a groundwater discharge?
Yes.
It's totally dependent on the soils. I don't think the soils have a lot of infiltration capacity in the city, so it could be a pretty large system. I don't know if you knew anything, Mike or Matt, if you've looked at that. You need a really coarse soil. I mean, we're just finishing the design of a MBR facility that has a groundwater discharge in up in Pierce County, Washington, and it has it's a 15-acre drain field, but it's it's cobbles. The water just flies right through, so it's a function of how fast the water infiltrates into the ground in terms of the sizing. So I don't have an answer for that. I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
You referred to year-round flow from the satellite plant to the Sandy, so, and the analysis, the draft plan talks about the total maximum daily load limits on the Clackamas side, doesn't refer to the Sandy. So I'm wondering what analysis you've done in terms of how you go about meeting the total maximum daily load, especially for temperature on the Sandy side, and how that affects the cost of that part of the system or the whole system.
Yeah, I think that question came up earlier. That's the piece we need to resolve is MBR effluent is not going to have a lot of BOD. It doesn't have any TSS. It has very low turbidity. So meeting the discharge requirements say that you have in your current permit is not generally a factor. We will nitrify and denitrify, so the nitrogen species is probably not going to be a problem as well. So ammonia toxicity is not something that I tend to be too concerned about. I think temperature is the key piece. We haven't done that analysis because it's dependent on a lot of factors that probably drive to what can you get for a waste load allocation when you're doing any degradation analysis, and then back that up into what's the temperature of the effluent coming off the plant, and what can we do between the plant and the discharge to mitigate the temperature. And those things were just, we have to know the discharge piece before we can back up into what the rest of it is. And the best way I have to answer it is there's too many unknowns for us to spend all of your money doing that evaluation yet. We need to get some more information before we can do that.
But you need to be able to do that to get a permit, don't you?
Yes, sir. Oh, absolutely. We're years away from getting a permit, probably, most likely.
But if you don't know if you can meet that standard, what's your confidence in being able to get a permit?
What's the standard? What's the standard?
The TMDL for the river. There's a written standard for the temperature,
Right.
times of year, and flow.
Yeah, I don't know what the standard's gonna drive us to. I know that it's core cold water habitat, which is a design temperature of 60.8. I think the effluent temperature at various times of year is gonna come off in the high 60s to low 70s, depending on the time of year. There's good history in treatment wetlands mitigating temperatures down into the median daily temperature with about 48 hours of storage. So what could we do in that type of system? Riparian shading is an option that's been done for Clean Water Services on the Tualatin River. Freshwater Trust is doing programs all over the West Coast looking at how to mitigate temperature with riparian restoration activities. So there's this wealth of options that you have to consider, and until we know what that delta is that we're trying to get to in terms of excess thermal load, the rest of them are difficult to analyze. That's the best answer I have for you right now.
But there's methods of cooling the water before getting it.
Yeah, I mean, you could always put in
If the permit says it has to be this temperature of this flow rate, there's methods of cooling it, correct?
Yeah, I mean, worst case, you put in a chiller, and you just pay energy to cool it like a refrigerator.
But are potential costs of that range of options built into your estimates, both in terms of capital and operating?
No, they're not. On the temperature piece, no, they're not. The way that I characterized it was we have a pretty large bucket, around $13 million for that outfall pipeline that we felt had quite a bit of additional, there's a lot of contingency in there, and hopefully the way we design the pipeline and how we incorporate other elements, hopefully that bucket is big enough to cover the temperature mitigation piece, but that's the next step we really have to look at, which is in the kind of continuing services scope that we're just starting. So that analysis has to be done really soon, which will be.
So we have 2 months of the year, the shoulder months we're calling it, May and October, that we have a lot of extra rain, which we cannot control, no one can control this. That happened during that. Has it been looked at, and what is the process to change the permit to allow those 2 shoulder months, because that's where we always get in trouble, which we have no control over the rain and how much rain happens, to change that permit to allow for a larger flow into Tickle Creek during those 2 months. Because we're human, we can't change what nature's bringing down, right?
The 3 basin rule prohibits that from happening.
Have we looked at going to Salem and lobbying for, look, this is reality, regardless? I'm not talking,
That's a great question. No, we have not.
Millions of extra gallons of water going down there.
Totally fair question.
But, it seems like a much easier problem than going, you know what, maybe the permit was done accurately with the timing, going, you're still in this time zone that has a lot of rain.
Mm-hmm.
So, you're causing a lot of stress or financial stress on not just our community, other communities as well, possibly, I don't know. But so you still might be in that 3 basin rule, but what's the process to change that? Lobby for it, whatever in Salem, to be able to do that? And would that cost be a lot less than $70 million?
Yeah, that I guess we're just engineers, so.
'Cause we're just 2 months, we're just
I know,
talking about May and October, right?
Hey,
And in that, we're probably only talking 2 weeks.
No, totally fair question.
Yeah.
And quite frankly, when it's raining a lot, there's probably plenty of flow in the creek. I mean,
That's exactly
you
my
can
point.
totally walk right down that path and see a pathway. The problem is, the rule's been around, and I don't know that it's been successfully challenged. And so there's been lots of discussions about the 3-basin rule up in Detroit, Idana, because of the septic tanks and everything that get into the system and the reservoir. Salem's very protective of it. I know that's been looked at. I don't know that there's ever been a successful challenge. I certainly wouldn't get into the realm of lobbying or suggesting anyone go lobby. If you could change it, we'll definitely look at whatever gets changed on your behalf.
I'd say nationwide, it's been a long slog. I mean, there's the process of blending where they bypass certain treatment processes and when peak flows happen, and they'll just do some portions that the treatment plant can handle, and then they'll just discharge that right into the receiving waters. That's been happening nationwide, and gosh, ever since I got my career, so at least 2 decades, there's been continual lawsuits by cities trying to fight against this. Oregon actually had the 5-year, 24-hour wet weather event that's regulated. That they used to write into their permits, and they actually were that was eliminated by EPA, saying you can't write an allowable discharge of raw wastewater into receiving bodies. So, and just for a community, as climate change happens or wet weather events get more and more extreme, just thinking about, well, how do we design a appropriately sized conveyance system and a treatment plant if we're never allowed to have a single drop of wastewater get into our receiving bodies when the 100-year storm happens? But that's currently where things are right now, and I think it would be a long slog to go through that process. In the meantime, still got all the constant challenges going on.
And we're not talking raw sewage, we're talking treated, even up to Isley's nursery, and then being able to pump that down. You're saying we have to go all the way to Deep Creek, which is another $10 million or whatever, just for that pipe. We're just talking about Tickle Creek treated water.
Yeah.
For 2 weeks, 1 week on each side, right? Or
Yeah.
2 months, right?
Yeah, so when EPA took this out of the Oregon DEQ issued permits, one of the things Oregon DEQ used to do, they had this internal directive just to their staff and to the cities saying, if you have any kind of discharge in excess of the 5-year event, well, they regulate the receiving waters on the bacterial standard. So by the amount of bacteria getting into the receiving waters, under wet weather events, our creeks, our rivers, they're rushing. A lot of water's coming in. So exactly what you're saying, those shoulder seasons, you got a lot of flow going. Is that really that big of a deal?
Exactly.
DEQ, I think, is a little bit on our side in that, just saying we've got to be realistic about the burden that we're putting on cities. They're also, I think, fighting. There was a contingent from the Association of Clean Water Agencies in Oregon that went up to Seattle to talk to EPA and was just met with a lot of, sorry, we're not allowing that. You can't write that into your permits anymore on behalf of the city. So
that's a great point. I don't know, is the city a member of Aqua?
Yes.
So, I mean, there is a lobbying group, there's a legislative committee for Aqua, Mike, you probably are aware of it, that does do lobbying down in Salem for clean water issues, for clean water agencies. That would be a great thing to bring up. Jerry Linder is the head of that. There's a committee chair for that, or for that chair, or for that committee, and he works for Clean Water Services. I could put you guys in touch with him. He might be able to help with some past history on the 3-basin rule and how successful a lobbying effort might be, just before you embark on that.
And just to be clear, I'm not talking dirty water, I'm talking clean.
No,
water.
we understand.
It's been up in storage,
Yeah.
it's coming down,
Yeah.
for 1 or 2 weeks on both sides of that shoulder.
Yeah, it's a fair point. It's, when you think of it logically, it makes sense. Sometimes the regulations that we have to design systems around don't make as much sense as we would like.
yeah, 15 to 1 that you have in your system, by the time you're said and done, most of that's rainwater and groundwater. When you're diluting what's normally a raw wastewater effluent, now it's 15 to 1 because of all the clean water that gets in. So, yeah, I'm with you. Just there is the human health and environment protection that we all have to be cognizant of. So.
What are you seeing with other communities? Because you said this is other communities, and we're having such huge growth in Portland metro region and other communities as well. growing, and there's a huge demand. I mean, we've heard crazy numbers of how many people are moving into the Portland proper Portland metro area, and we sit outside metro a little bit, but as Stan was saying, you know, we're in the top 5 growing, which is pretty small. I mean, we're still a small community, and we grow a little, you know, we add a couple hundred residents, and we see that high percentage, but we have so many people moving into our areas that, you know, where are people gonna live? I mean, what are you seeing with other communities? Because they all gonna be having the exact same problem.
They are.
We're building
They are.
houses like this,
Yep.
so at what point, I mean, when are,
Housing prices will continue to go up, and, I mean, every community we work in is stressed from growth, so there was a little bit of pent-up availability of developable lands when the recession hit, and we've kind of just plowed right through that, and now I think a lot of our clients, and we do a lot of work for a lot of the communities in the Portland metro area, I think every one of them is starting to feel some pressure on the facility side. I don't know what you think, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, well, once, you know, I'm working in Gresham, but they have the Columbia River right there. I mean, it's a huge river to discharge to. You guys are discharging Tickle Creek, so I mean, it's you know, there's other creeks discharging to smaller rivers too, but Tickle Creek's probably one of the smaller creeks that we've seen discharged to, right? I mean, that's
For this side, definitely for the size of the community you are and will be, it's just, it's a really difficult discharge.
Yeah. And there's issues at base flow, right? There's exceedance of the dilution rule at base flows, not even rainwater events, right? So throughout the year, so you're right on the edge of that. I think you can get violations outside of those shoulder seasons.
Yeah,
as
we
well,
actually, if we plotted the violation summary, at peak flows, there tends to be enough water that you don't violate the dilution rule. It's actually when it happens at this, what we call max month flows. So if you plotted all of the flow events on a line that went from lowest flow to highest flow, the violations of the dilution rule actually happen in the left side of the graph, not on the right side of the graph. Just one point of reference, Clean Water Services spends $40 million a year. They have 4 treatment plants and serve all of Washington County. And they don't see that ending in the foreseeable future.
Sounds like you guys in the city have done a very thorough job of thinking to the future and planning, and thank you for the presentation and all the time to answer public questions. I have a question about, until the plan is implemented, you know, between now and then, I imagine it will be several years before anything actually gets built. Do you also have some suggestions for how the city can avoid the exceedances, the violations that you just mentioned in the interim, both for the plant discharge and including chlorine to Tickle Creek?
Great question. I think the chlorine issue's been resolved because that was a pipe failure. So hopefully the taking issue that happened was a one-time incident. I think it was I think a pipe was dug into. So hopefully that issue's resolved. There have been, I think we just had a meeting with DEQ, and there have been continuing violations of the current permit. What we've kind of discussed or talked about in that meeting with DEQ was to give the city some time to let the rehab elements of the program that'll be done out of the gate have some success. And there is a track record, Sweet Home and other places, where DEQ has provided the time for communities to see the effectiveness of rehab in terms of compliance. So the hope is that we get in and we start working on the system and getting the system rehabilitated. Those flows start to drop. I believe in Sweet Home, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, the peak flows came down, but the base flows also came down because they tightened up the whole system. So the hope is that we see those flows drop. That's better for the treatment process. It's better in May and October. That hopefully bridges the gap to when there would be a new facility online. There's also a bucket of money that's been allocated out of the gate to do some process related and other upgrades at the treatment plant that are needed from the condition evaluation we did. So not going to ignore the treatment plant by any means. It does need some work to be done. But hopefully the big investments, you save up your money and reserve that to build a new facility before you go back and kind of fix the remainder of the existing treatment plant so you're ready to go for the next 20 years. Did that answer your question?
Somewhat. So what would the timeline be that you said DEQ has sometimes given the city some time? So what is that timeline?
Rob has to answer that one because that's too hard for me.
I think it's city specific. I would say this about DEQ and my interactions with them. I mean, oftentimes regulatory agencies feel like Big Brother with a hammer ready to, anytime you do something wrong, and I think our experience with DEQ is they want to do the right thing, make sure that we're protecting the environment. For Sweet Home, for St. Helens, I know they waived civil penalties for overflows during these periods early on where they were definitely showing great faith efforts in doing the rehab work in the collection system as well as improvements in the treatment facility. I don't know the levels that Sandy has had in terms of those discussions with DEQ, but they're willing to work with communities because they realize, okay, Sandy's right now trying to do the right thing, and then what's the best way for them to work with that and get the city on a schedule that's reasonable, specifically for the dollars that's facing the city. So I don't know, Mike, or if anyone else has anything from the specific negotiations or discussions with DEQ.
It's the very early stages. I mean, this part of the additional scope that's added on with Murray Smith's contract is negotiate the timeline for the existing MAO. And our last conversation with DEQ is they think they want to pursue a two-track thing, existing MAO to keep us on track for the alternative D or whatever the selected alternative is, and then another MAO track for improvements to the collection system and the existing plant.
When the big wet weather comes, just tell everyone just to hold it for a little longer. That would probably be really helpful.
No, we've told them that doesn't matter because it's all rainwater.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Yes, sir.
It seems like in the systems that you've looked at or built up estimates for, none of them address the temperature issue. We already talked about that. Why don't any of them address natural treatment systems, which have been extremely cost effective for a lot of communities in the state? Why don't they address that?
Do you have a specific natural treatment system in mind? Are you thinking wetlands or what?
Yeah.
So tend to be pretty land intensive. Don't tend to see a lot of them in the area of the state where you're at is the best example, and at the size flow that you have. There are a lot of smaller natural systems that work great. Vernonia has a really good lagoon system with a high rate of discharge. That's a really small community. That's the best reference example I can get. Roseburg is a great example, although they have a mechanical treatment plant with the back end wetland system for cooling.
Right.
Their facility costs a lot more than yours will. They spent a lot of money on their wastewater treatment plant over the years.
Well, according to the DEQ document, the initial system that they were estimating was a $100 million system, but the system that they built with natural system treatment ended up being a $10 million system.
Yeah, so that's the back end. So they have the treatment plant that was already there. The alternatives they looked at were expand the treatment plant, and I believe the basis of that was a chiller, if I'm not mistaken. That was the $100 million number. And then they did build, they had a ton of land right along the river, and so they built an overland discharge system for cooling. That was the $10 million cost. But they still had their installed infrastructure at their wastewater plant. So, I mean, when you say natural system, I'm thinking natural treatment system as in lagoon-based system, constructed wetlands, FWS, free water surface wetlands, subsurface wetlands, whatever type of system you're looking at. They don't tend to be high-rate systems, so they tend to be land-intensive. I don't know that this is, we would be happy to look at that. I just don't know that it would pencil out. So we didn't look at that. There's no good answer to your question.
So along those lines, in terms of natural system versus a chiller system, just to comment with experience of chillers, it's highly volatile in terms of your cost.
Totally.
And usually it only goes up. And with energy supply in the region, any kind of chilling system, the cost could become astronomical in the future.
Agreed. And every time I've looked at them, the capital cost is not high, but the O&M cost is astronomical. We looked at those for the city of Corvallis on their temperature TMDL project that I led for 7 or 8 years. That was easily the highest cost option. And cooling towers don't really get you the shoulders, just like irrigation doesn't get you the shoulders. So cooling towers don't tend to work really well in Western Oregon in May and October. So that's a difficult solution there either, even though they have lower O&M costs than chillers.
So how often would you replace a wetland versus a refrigeration unit? I mean, how often would you replace a wetland? Would be there indefinitely, right?
Yeah, I don't know, well, I don't know that you would replace a wetland. I think at times you have to go in to remove the detritus that settles off because they start to fill up a little bit. The best reference for that is the Fernhill Wetlands for Clean Water Services, which is in Forest Grove. And they haven't got to a place where they'll have that data, but they do have an active management plan. And that wetland is 90 acres. It was designed to cool 18 MGD to the 64.4, which is the TMDL temperature for the 12th River. It's rearing migration.
You say 90 acres?
It is 90 acres. The south wetlands is 90 acres for 18 MGD.
So, just curiosity, and you probably didn't look into this. We have Roslyn Lake that was right over the hill on the other side of the Sandy River.
Formerly known as
Roslyn Lake, sorry. It was a lake for 100 years as the dam, the little Sandy was there, you know. It'd be interesting to know what the cost would just, instead of trying to chill it, just to flow it right over there and empty it out into Roslyn. The formerly known as Roslyn Lake, right there, which is just, it's all built to be able to do that.
We already have the paddle boats.
Yeah.
It's like 300 and something acres.
It's a large area.
So one thing that does work, so I was the civil lead for the design of the Fernhill Wetlands that I just talked about. What they have as part of that free water surface wetland is a deep zone, which is they call a lake. It's about 12 foot deep. So what they actually do on really hot days is they manage the temperature of the discharge. They withdraw water off the bottom of the lake. That water tends to be pretty cold because it gets to groundwater temperatures. So if there, I mean, I don't know what that is, that lake, or the not named that lake, but
It's a big green patch.
if it's man-made, and we can sort out the lake discharge issues with mixing zone requirements, and we could pull out a bottom withdrawal, which is what they do out of the dams to pull the cold water out all along the Willamette. It's a fair, I mean, it's something.
They did it for 100 years. It was PGE owned it, owned the land.
So
We did the design to decommission that, so.
What's that?
We did the design to decommission that lake.
Oh, okay.
Don't say that now.
I know. We already talked about it. So we looked at, I think we said it was over a mile away, right? Something like that.
But the cost, some of the cost of cooling it and other things that may be a cheaper rate. I don't know. Those are the numbers that need to come back. But
get the sign.
Just trying to think outside the box.
Yeah, a truly viable option is thermal stratification in deep water bodies. As long as you can create enough stratification, you can use that for discharge. I totally believe that. And we did it on a smaller discharge in the city of Dundee, where they have a large storage lagoon on the back end of their MBR. So that is an option that we could look at, should there be a viable location.
It'd be a cooling option for cooling.
Preston, I'm gonna throw a question at you too. Sorry, I know I'm not supposed to do this. Isn't I think Clean Water Services, and not being a treatment guy, I thought one of the things they're doing is a basin-wide look at temperature, and that's why they're like planting a lot of trees along their stream corridors and things, where they're trying to reduce temperature that way through other means rather than the really high cost of cooling on the treatment side of things. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay.
They've got the wetlands in Forest Grove. So from Forest Grove down to Tiger, that's the Tualatin River. So that's that entire area has a pretty strict temperature TMDL. So they built the treatment wetlands for the discharge out of Forest Grove, and then they can't really do much with the two bigger plants. Their two biggest plants are Rock Creek and Durham. They're down low in the basin, and they have really high temperatures. So it's a multi-layered approach. So they're doing tree planting up in the riparian corridor. That's been highly successful, partnering with property owners. They're also in partnership to raise Hag Lake, and that would be water that would be directed into Tualatin River for in-stream use. And that's to achieve the temperature limit. So you put the riparian restoration in with the wetlands and the Hag Lake, the additional water that they'll be pulling in through that dam raise. That's their intent to meet their temperature requirements.
I think the key is that you haven't done the temperature evaluation
Yes, yes, it is.
And we're all really curious about it. And when you get to that point, I mean, there are a myriad of different options for mediating temperature and addressing the mitigation for the temperature. The key is looking at that basin-wide impact of temperature at this point. We're all waiting with bated breath.
Do you want to switch? I will sit there if you want to, because that's a perfect answer.
Well, oh, go ahead, Carol. No, I was going for the wrap up, man, so you better wrap up.
No, I was gonna say, you brought it up in kind of a humorous way to say, asking people to hold it. And I know that sounds funny, but on the other hand, it's another of these elements of a potential outreach and conservation strategy that at a broader level is potentially effective tool in the toolbox. And so having, there are other communities, I can't name them now, but I can find out, that are developing notification systems for a time that might stress the system and asking for voluntary delay of things like dishwashers, washing machines, other processes that would produce additional wastewater. So it's a very serious potential input to a broader strategy of preventative demand management. So while, again, I appreciate that we can't just ask people to hold it, but in fact we can.
Yeah.
And as a part of a broader strategy, that's one thing that we really should take seriously.
Right, yeah, for sure, and that's a great point. I think Preston, you brought up after I made that joke, in some basins you're as high as 15-1 here in the city of Sandy. So even if you were to reduce that base flow, which is domestic flow, which is around 1 million, maybe a little less.
Less than
1 million
gallons per day.
Yeah, 1 million gallons per day. That's the flow rate at the peak of when it's dry out and just regular wastewater is coming through. So we could ask for that conservation method that you still have an extra 14, potentially 13 million gallons of clean water getting in and hitting the treatment plant. And there's nothing that we can do right now.
Until we tighten up the system.
But once we tighten up the system, that will help. And then I think for sure then some of those conservation methods will see a greater impact at that point. Once we reduce all that clean water that's getting in. Does that kind of make sense?
My apologies for coming in the discussion late tonight, but I think that my understanding was, and I heard you say, your analysis and report didn't do a stormwater management plan or analysis to look at the other upstream actions that can take place to reduce the amount of stormwater getting in toward the pipes and then into the system, right?
No, that's not quite accurate. That's actually the first thing that the city's gonna do this summer is try to find where some of that clean water sources are and try to get them off the sanitary system as quickly as possible. So that's like.
But the layer of having a citywide stormwater management plan that might use green infrastructure, rain gardens, surface features to divert the water has not been done.
That's correct. We did not do that. We were focused on sanitary sources. Yeah.
And because the city of Sandy's a separated system, it's unlike Portland where the stormwater goes directly into the same pipes that the domestic wastewater is in. And so if you build green infrastructure, rain gardens, that kind of thing that slows that direct water from getting right into the pipe systems, that's great on a combined system. What we have here in the city of Sandy is a separated system where you have a separate stormwater system and a separate sanitary system. So even by building rain gardens and other things, detention ponds, that's not necessarily gonna prevent what's already happening in the sanitary system. It's just gonna slow the flow rate of what's going into the stormwater system, if that makes sense. So I do, yeah, a stormwater management plan is always a great thing to have. I don't know if that will help solve any major issues with the sanitary system that's going on.
I just wanted to thank Murray Smith for coming in here tonight and conducting this presentation. We still have several weeks left of the public comment period during this process, and the one message I wanted everyone to know here as well is it's council's priority to have a very kind of upfront, outbound discussion with our community. We're fully transparent and engaging all the stakeholders early on and throughout this process. So thank you for showing up here tonight and asking your questions. And this is just kind of the very beginning of a process that we hope to keep everybody very engaged in. So thank you all for coming here tonight. Thank you, Mary Smith.
Thank you. Preston, real quick, people want to send in information.